Alrighty guys, welcome back here once again. Trevor here, and today I'm going to be doing a video that's a bit different than what I do usually. Today I'm going to be having a bit of a discussion, a bit of a debate with one of my close friends about the recent lawsuit between Apple and Epic concerning Apple's App Store and Epic getting booted off, specifically Fortnite, for implementing a direct payment system that went over the head of Apple's payment system. And so today I have with me Justin Proulx, who is an app developer and a tweak developer. And Justin, if you'd like to introduce yourself a bit more,
Hi, you
please
can
go
follow
ahead.
me on Twitter at JustinAlexP.
do you want do you want to talk a little bit about your apps on the App Store?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a developer and I build iOS apps and jailbreak tweaks, but this is mostly about my apps. So my most popular app is called Impeach Be the President. It's a president simulation game on the App Store, and earlier this year I ran into some trouble with Apple over one of the scenarios in the game, which the game came out in 2018, and it's sort of a text-based, scenario-based game. And one of the scenarios involves a fictional, generic pandemic, which has been in the game since 2018. But as soon as the current situation began, Apple decided that it was no longer appropriate for the App Store, and they threatened to kick me out for that. So I'm no longer able to update it or add new content or do anything like that, which is just fantastic. So definitely, I was very glad when Epic decided to step in and do something about it.
Okay. And so speaking specifically of the Apple v. Epic lawsuit, so I'm just going to introduce it a bit for you guys who haven't heard of it or kind of maybe a bit rusty or need a bit to catch up. So on August 13th, Fortnite was removed from the App Store after implementing a direct payment system instead of the required App Store payment processor. And so I might put a little screenshot up here, but basically Epic basically snuck a little update through that Apple hadn't approved, which basically allowed users to purchase the V-Bucks, which is the Fortnite currency, through Epic themselves for a discounted price instead of through Apple, who charges a 30% commission on all purchases done through the App Store. And so Epic was kicked off as a result for breaking the terms of service that they had agreed to with Apple, and when they and being able to put your apps and provide updates on the App Store. And so as a result, Epic filed a lawsuit immediately following, and they accused Apple of monopolistic practices, including targeting that 30% commission, and also the fact that Apple does not allow competing app stores on iOS devices. And so Epic was alleging that they had no choice but to accept Apple's terms, and as a result, that would be a monopoly and a break of antitrust laws. And so Epic, and also to add, Epic actually did the same thing with Google, and they did also get kicked off the Google Play Store. And with Google, it's a bit different because I mentioned before that Apple does not allow competing app stores, but Google does. The difference here is that Epic was alleging that the way Google has implemented this system, it is so it is very difficult and overly complicated to download and use other app stores, that in practice, the Google Play Store is nonetheless a monopoly. And so since that time, they've kind of been fighting back and forth. At one point, Apple had deleted Epic's developer account, which also affected the Unreal Engine, which is another big product by Epic. And that caused a big stir, and Epic was seeking injunctive relief from that, and they actually received a lot of support from other companies as well, including notably one big notable example would be Microsoft, as well as other game developers who relied on that Unreal game engine. And so for a while they were kind of bickering back and forth until just a few days ago they had an initial hearing between Apple and Epic, and it didn't go so well for Epic, and the judge was clearly more in favor of Apple's argument, and this centered more so around the fact that Epic accepted and knew full well the terms that Apple had set forth. And so when they broke those terms and got kicked off, the judge didn't really, didn't really like that, and didn't really feel that Epic was truly being a victim in this circumstance. And the judge also wasn't too convinced and was very skeptical of the claims that Apple was a monopoly, just because for Fortnite users, there are different avenues instead of iOS to actually play Fortnite. However, this was just the initial hearing, and the judge did recommend a jury trial for next July, and that the judge has not, but will rule soon about injunctive relief concerning putting back Fortnite on the App Store, although it doesn't sound that that is very likely at this point. So Justin, I know you mentioned a little bit of, previously about your experiences, specifically regarding to your game Impeached. Do you want to talk a little bit more about what the general sentiment is towards Apple by app developers?
Sure. So, I mean, personally, me for a long time, I dealt with the 30% tax, as well as, Apple's somewhat strange guidelines, I guess we could say. And I personally just dealt with it for a long time, but it became more and more apparent that those guidelines aren't evenly applied to everyone. And they have some odd exceptions and loopholes that they allow to get around certain rules for some apps, but not everybody. So when you see Epic getting booted off of the App Store for using a non-in-app purchase payment system, but then you see Amazon being allowed to sell their goods without using in-app purchase. And yeah, I understand that they're selling, two different kinds of content. One of them is digital goods and one of them is shipping stuff to your house, right? And I get that, but it just seems that, if there's rules, they should apply to everyone. And as time goes on, you begin to notice that Apple truly doesn't apply the rules evenly. And I think that's a big thing. I think the censorship is a problem. And in my opinion, I think that having alternative app stores and the ability to install other apps, even if it's somewhat complicated process to get that done, I think that would be a massive improvement over the system that we have now. And I think that a lot of developers are frustrated and fed up because we've seen our apps be rejected from the App Store for stupid reasons that don't make sense, or reasons that aren't even true for me in some cases. And you put in all this work building an app, weeks and weeks, months, maybe even years, building this app just for it to get rejected by app review for a violation of some guideline that they just so happen to choose.
Okay. So I'll just kind of deconstruct that a little bit. Sure. The first point you mentioned was that 30%, we can call it a tax, we can call it a commission, but in any case, I should also mention that I am an Apple shareholder, so I'm going to try and represent the kind of Apple view of things, or at least the shareholder view of things. But the 30% is pretty common as a commission for distributors of online content and even physical retailers. So I think that in that aspect, I don't think Apple is necessarily being super aggressive or super unreasonable in their prices. And sure, you might consider 30% to be a lot, but it is in many cases the industry standard, and usually going less than that is what is unconventional. So you can see the 30% kind of across the industry, and other examples such as Steam for Windows games, and on PlayStation, Xbox, even Google Play, the 30% is pretty common. So I think on that aspect, I'm not exactly sure that Epic has a very strong case, especially if they're trying to push for that monopolistic, that antitrust aspect. So,
But there's a difference between Apple and all the other providers that do that. The difference is that if you're developing an app for Windows, you can choose to distribute it through Steam. If you're developing a game, for example, you can choose to distribute it through Steam. But if you don't like the fact that they take a large cut, you can distribute it through Epic. You can distribute it through your own website. You can build a platform yourself. You can put it on a USB stick and ship it across the country, and nobody will say a word about it, right? Except maybe your users. But anyways, but if you build on Android, sort of the same deal. Most developers go through Google Play, but if you want to, you can go outside of Google Play and avoid the 30%, right? Because I think we can both agree that it's the somewhat high percentage of your earnings. But on Apple, you don't have that choice, and Apple actively tries to take that choice away from you by taking down developers who have began to distribute apps outside of the App Store. For a long time, people have been trying to find ways of installing apps without the App Store. And I mean, years ago, there was a trick where you had to set your date back to like the summer of the year before, and then Apple fixed that. And there's been many other methods just to try to get around that App Store censorship issue. And it's still an ongoing battle. And that's not the case on any other platform, even Mac OS. So I think it's really the combination of that high price, the censorship, and the inability to distribute things independently.
Well, I would also say that I did mention PlayStation and Xbox, and unless I'm wrong, but as far as I know, those you have to go through the PlayStation Store, the Xbox Game Store.
You do, but I would argue in this case that a mobile device or a tablet would be more similar to being a PC tier device than a game console, because these have generic apps, right? On a PlayStation or Xbox, you expect to, predominantly be playing games, but on mobile devices, these are computing devices just like your computer. You can install the same categories of apps, mobile versions. There's a lot of apps that are even, cross-platform between desktop and mobile as well. And I think that with these conditions, it doesn't make sense to have to distribute your software through one store. And that's a bit of an overreach. And I think Apple is kind of in bad faith in not allowing the installation of apps outside of the App Store.
Well, to that, I would say, I mean, why should game consoles and normal PCs be necessarily treated any differently? Like, are you gonna start saying that game consoles are special, and is there any specific reason for that? And I mean, there's also the fact that you can download generic apps on your PlayStation and Xbox. So, I mean, maybe it is one more than the other, or maybe it's somewhere in between. But I think it also concerns the fact that, at least legally speaking, when you're talking about something like this, is a closed off, a walled ecosystem illegal? Is that monopolistic in and of itself, especially if the only way for someone to independently distribute or add to those products is through your own services?
Well, I mean, we'll start with the first point about consoles being different. And at the end of the day, I guess you're right, they're not. But I would love to see consoles be able to install third-party games and apps independently. Previous generations of consoles, I'm not too familiar with the current one, but I know previous generations of consoles, a lot of them were hacked to do exactly that. The PS3 had a Linux distro pre-installed so that you could develop homebrew and run it on your own system. consoles, people have been fighting on the console, on consoles to be able to install their own stuff on there as well for a long time as well. And I think that's a valid concern with consoles. It would be great to see all devices be able to run software that, you know, even that you developed or that somebody posted on GitHub, or, you know, just cool apps that don't necessarily have a place in the respective store of that platform.
Hmm. Well, I do think definitely for developers it would be absolutely advantageous to have
And users as
any
well.
platform be free and open. Um, but since this is, you know, a case concerning antitrust laws
Mm.
and all that, a big part of it is whether or not this is actually breaking the law. Because, um, I mean, from my view, in my honest opinion, I don't think that Epic has the strongest case here, and I completely expect Apple to win this case unless something major happens. And it should also be added that there are, you know, hearings and a lot of discussion going on in Congress about uh, antitrust and potentially adding some more antitrust laws, potentially using some antitrust laws, which may also affect this case outside of the purely court, what's going on in court. But I would also say that in Apple's case, they could also make the argument that having this walled ecosystem and having them be the only sort of arbitrator to decide, okay, what can go on, what cannot go on the App Store, does help a little bit with concerns towards security and privacy compared to, you know, Google Play even, or especially on PC.
Well, that's the thing. In my opinion, the App Store tends to give more of an illusion of security than anything else. Because what makes iOS devices secure isn't the reviewers reviewing the apps. Let's be real, those guys are not very good at it, their jobs, to be honest. The parts that make it secure are the features that are baked into iOS, which would apply to any app downloaded outside of the App Store anyway, such as sandboxing, which prevents apps from accessing data of other apps, and pretty much just isolates each app into its own, you know, container. And that's great for privacy and for security. There's the permission system, which makes sure that apps, even downloaded outside of the App Store or that you're developing yourself, you do have to grant them permissions explicitly, and that's not part of the App Store either. Um, in fact, the App Store was a distributor for one of the most widespread cases of, well, I guess it was malware. With Xcode Ghost, a few years ago, there was a version of Xcode, which, for those who don't know, is the tool that developers use to build apps. And basically, long story short, there was sort of a modified copy of Xcode that was being used in certain areas where they had trouble downloading the official one. And that version of Xcode injected this code into the apps that it built, and those apps went on the App Store, did not get caught by app review. And there were a number of large apps. I think it was mostly in the Chinese App Store, but don't quote me on that. But there were a number of large apps that were getting downloads and were all infected, and app review didn't stop that period, and I don't think they could have. I don't think that there's any advantage for the user in locking out every other provider. I think the way that Google does it is actually pretty good. And I know that you mentioned that Epic was suing them because it was too complicated to install like third-party app stores. And I think that's a little bit silly because I think most normal users have no interest in doing that, and it would be detrimental to their user experience. But I think that advanced users who know what they're doing should be understood to be capable and understanding enough to know what to not install. So if these people go and explicitly toggle that option off and, you know, go download apps from other sources, I think those people should be technology literate enough to be able to stay safe on their own. Because look at what we have on Windows or even on Mac OS. It's the same deal, isn't it? You open your browser, excuse me. You open your browser and you can download any app without using the Microsoft Store or the Apple App Store for Mac.
Oh, well, I think my response to that would be, I'm not saying that the App Store process is going to guarantee 100% safety, 100% no viruses, no malware, no nothing. But even if we are to look at an example concerning Fortnite and Epic, because that would be ultimately relevant, when Fortnite was first released, it was only, well, first of all, in the first case, it was only released on Android, but it was not released through the Play Store,
Right.
and it was released through Epic. But what happened with that is that there were a lot of false or malicious distributions of Fortnite that weren't the actual fully legitimate Fortnite version, and that caused a lot of problem with Android phones, and that is a potential risk that you take when you say, okay,
Right. But
you can
look,
download from any source.
if you've bought a device that can be worth up to $1,000, even higher if you have the higher configurations, I think at that point, owning the device, I think that a warning is definitely, recommended. But beyond that, I think it should be really left up to the users to decide what to install. And for Fortnite in particular, considering how big of an app it is, it truly is common sense to just get it from the official source, considering it's such a big company and the source is probably very easy to find. So anybody who downloads a bootleg version probably shouldn't have been playing with those settings in the first place. And you could say the same on Windows too. If there's a game that comes out and people decide to, for example, pirate it, or they decide to download it from a site that isn't the developer's website or the game's official site, well, of course you're going to get some problems. I think that's just sort of common sense at that point. You have to be somewhat tech literate if you're going to go, off the beaten path and do things yourself. I just think that we shouldn't be prevented from doing things ourselves if we want to. Because, I mean, even right now, iOS users can install what they want to. They just have to jailbreak their phones, which comes with another set of pros and cons, which we won't get into. But it's not like it's impossible, and it has been shown before. And over time, people learn, and they learn to install things from trusted sources only, to be careful about what they install on their phones. And that's just good practice on any internet-connected device.
I think there might also be an argument for Apple here because, well, first of all, one big thing for Apple and Apple devices and the sort of the value offer that they're offering to their consumers is the fact that you kind of get this sort of peace of mind more so than you get from any other companies' products. And so, if you are going to allow kind of outside downloads and whatnot. And if I take the Fortnite example again, I'm sure a lot of those people getting malware may be, young kids, or we have to accept the fact that not everybody's going to be super tech literate. And so they may not realize necessarily that they're downloading from a malicious source, a sketchy source. And that might create a lot of liability for Apple, especially when, for whatever reason, that malware and that whatever problems those malicious downloads cause, that they break the phone, and Apple, might be forced to fix the phone if it's still under warranty. And
well, that's the thing. I mean, any trouble caused by a downloaded app is probably going to be somewhat limited. Off the top of my head, I don't remember any malware for iOS on non-jailbroken devices having, very wide effects across your system. And worst case scenario, even if you mess something up while jailbroken, you can always restore your phone, bring it back to its original state, and keep going as if nothing happened. It's possible to, recover from these mistakes. I think users would still get that peace of mind, even if there was an option. And it could even be, branded as a developer option or advanced users option. And that would probably deter most people from touching that. And I think that even if Apple gave us this ability, most people would still just stick to the App Store because that's what they know. And there's nothing wrong with that. I'm just looking for more choices because Apple is very inconsistent with their rules on the App Store. So there are some apps that don't make it to the App Store that should exist. And this, in the end, is harming users in general because they don't have access to those products. Those products can't exist, and there's one company behind it that regulates what apps can and can't exist. And I think that that's a lot of power to wield as one company. And I don't remember the exact stats, but if I remember correctly, I think that in the US, Apple, or in North America, Apple has something around 58% market share. And while legally I don't think that would be a monopoly because I believe it's 2/3, that's pretty close. And if you take the duopoly between Apple and Google, those two combined have virtually 100% of the market share. So if you're not going with one, you have to go with the other. And I mean, yeah, so Google does allow, outside apps and whatnot, but if you take the Android users, you're losing all of those iOS users, which are typically the more profitable users. And effectively, you're being shut out of your own business by Apple because they decided that your app wasn't good enough for the App Store or your app wasn't appropriate for the App Store. And I think that that's not right. I don't think that that should be tolerated. I think that I would really appreciate if, whether of their own will or, coerced by the court to do so, to allow external apps to be installed, third-party apps. And honestly, if they did that, they can keep the 30% tax, and I wouldn't complain about it. I'd be very happy with that. And just to touch on a previous point about the 30% being too high or not too high, if Apple gave us good tools and good app review, 30%, I would be quiet, no problem. And they did for quite a while, but now, I mean, Xcode is still pretty decent, but App Store Connect is an ancient pile of trash. App review is a mess to go through. It's just not a pleasant experience for the amount that we're forced to pay.
So I think there's a few points there. Your first point, you talked a little bit about, just having the outside apps be a bit of a developer tool, and I think that that's definitely an interesting thought. You also said that users could restore their device if they wanted to instead of going to Apple. But again, the people who would be going to Apple in the first place are probably the ones who aren't as tech literate for this kind of problem.
Well, you can restore your device on device by just going to General, Reset. It's not a hard process. And I'm sure everybody has at least one friend who knows what they're doing somewhat with tech and would be able to find that setting and clear to the device, no problem. If there really is a big problem, it's a matter of plugging your phone into your computer and pressing restore. And if you personally can't do that, first of all, maybe you shouldn't have installed questionable things on your phone. But second of all, if you know enough people, there's going to be one in there that plays games or is a developer or, knows computers in some way that would be able to help.
That would be the hope, but I feel I would definitely say that it would definitely add liability for Apple in that respect. You also,
I mean, but just sorry, I don't mean to cut you off, but it would add liability to Apple in the same way that Windows viruses add liability to Microsoft. They don't. Developers that, create malicious software and people get infected, I don't think Microsoft's really on the hook for that. That's mostly the creators of the malware and the people who installed it. And with desktop computers, I think most people understand that you're not supposed to install, suspicious things on your device. And I think more people would understand that on mobile as well if it were even an opportunity, but we haven't even been able to see that possibility.
Well, I think it is a bit different than Microsoft and Windows, just because the majority of Windows computers are, first of all, the hardware is not, it's by a third-ware hardware
Okay, so what about Macs?
company like Dell. Sorry?
What about Macs? It's the same thing. It's a desktop OS. It's the same. Apple's not on the hook for, you know, Mac Cleaner or anything, which is, you know, known as being scamware on Mac OS.
But
And
if
it
it,
exists.
I'm saying since, well, okay, in my specific case, especially talking about devices, especially since a lot of them are bought through the Apple Store, and so that comes with a warranty and the potential to having to fix any issues with that hardware. And so when you buy an iPhone, for example, from the Apple Store, and say you happen to get in a situation where you had malware and you don't really know what you're doing, which may be why you're in that position in the first place, but,
Mhm.
and you can say, well, they shouldn't be doing that, but at the end of the day, it does happen.
Sure. But
And
you
they
know where else
may,
that does happen?
what?
On Macs. And Macs are also bought straight from the App Store. Mac OS isn't perfect. You can install some questionable things on it. And those Macs could be in warranty and people can bring them into the App Store. But I mean, at the end of the day, you paid for that device, right? And that's a service that Apple chooses to offer through the Genius Bar. So I don't think that that's really a liability there. I think that it would make it comparable to what's on Mac, but even less wide-reaching because uh, iOS, I suppose by design, is more locked down. You know, there's less things you can do with it. Apps get less permissions; they can't access, you know, the entire file system at all or anything crazy like that, right? They're sort of contained within themselves and for the most part can't really do anything outside of the app itself. So okay, so maybe you might, you know, get your data stolen or whatnot, but that's possible on desktop as well. But and you won't likely see, you know, hardware issues resulting from this or widespread software issues from it. I don't think that that's a valid reason to lock down the iOS so much as to disallow users from installing independent apps.
But I also think from Apple's perspective, iPhones, there are way more iPhones, and when you add iPads too, there's way
Mm-hmm.
more iOS devices than there are Macs. I don't have the exact numbers with me, but off the top of my head, I'm pretty sure iPhone sales annually tend to average around 5 to 6 times the amount of Mac sales, and
I don't
especially when you
remember
consider
specifically.
that Macs are tend to be more expensive, though not by as much as they used to be. That means even there's even more iPhones being sold more than the 5 or 6 times. So
I Yeah, but I'm not sure that that even matters because I think that the based off of the number of users of Mac OS and even Windows that I've seen having problems from downloading third-party software, I if we apply that same ratio to iOS devices, I don't think that the raw number would be that high. And out of those, not all of them will go to the Apple Store. Most people will probably be able to sort it out on themselves because, I mean, the easiest way to get rid of a suspicious app is to delete it, right? Um, so I'm not convinced that that would be such a burden on Apple that they have to absolutely lock out all apps that don't conform to the App Store. Like I feel this is a way for Apple to collect their full tax for the 30%, and second, a way to control the content that is available on their platform. And I don't think that's right. I understand that there are some rules that the App Store requires to be able to distribute through there, and that's fine as long as they would apply them evenly, which they don't, but that's a whole other issue. Um, but I think it would be more I think it would be more competitive. I think it would be more fair to both developers and users. And I think it would just be a net benefit overall to allow non-App Store apps to be installed on iOS without having to use any kind of weird workaround or, you know, spending collectively spending a lot of time as, you know, iOS community in discovering and developing new methods to install apps from outside of the App Store. There have been so many. There was a tool called Impactor where you would log in with your Apple ID and password, and it would sign the app that you wanted and install it to your device for 7 days. But you had to repeat that every 7 days. There was the one with the date workaround where you had to scroll your date back, install the app, and then bring your date back to normal, I think. There was another one where you had to use a weird tool to patch your device so that certain apps would be able to be installed. Right now, the most prominent one is called AltStore, and it's by the developer of an emulator called Delta and also GBA for iOS, which both have had trouble with distribution over the last 6 years. He created a new store called AltStore, and to use AltStore, you have to use the Apple ID thing to get that installed, and then from there, you have to use AltStore to keep refreshing the apps. And don't get me wrong, it is phenomenal. Like, I respect Riley Testa and his work incredibly, but this wouldn't even be necessary if Apple would just let people install stuff from outside the App Store. None of this would be required.
I think another interesting way to look at it, and this is especially what a big part of what Apple has been saying, and one of the claims and kind of an integral part to Epic's argument in this lawsuit is that the App Store is separate from the iOS operating system as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
And so it kind of begs the question, okay, well, is the App Store its own separate product, or is it own separate service, or is it still a part of iOS? Because I mean, the way it's been, in my opinion, and the way it looks like to me, is that the App Store is just one offering of iOS, and not a separate offering distinct from iOS.
Well, I might have some bad news for you, because if I remember correctly, Apple themselves consider App Store profits and earnings under the services category and not with iPhone or with anything else. I think that's a fair argument on Epic's part to make, that the App Store is separate. I don't think that the App Store is necessarily a feature of iOS. It is a distribution method for software on iOS. I think that would be like comparing, for example, the Mail app. The Mail app is a mail app. But if you go on the App Store, you can download Outlook and Gmail and Yahoo and, email apps for other providers. And I think that that's fair. However, I think it would also be fair if you could install alternative app distribution methods without having to have any of these bizarre workarounds. Because at the end of the day, the App Store is an app that installs other apps. You know what else is an app that installs other apps? App Installer by myself, Jamie, Aiden, and one guy named Creature Survive. It's an app that installs other apps, right? And Epic has an app that installs other apps with the Epic Store. I don't think it's fair to tie that one particular app and service to iOS completely. Apple Music, for example. Apple Music is baked into to iOS as well, just like the App Store and the Mail app. But at the end of the day, users have a choice on whether they want to take Apple Music or if they want to use Spotify or Pandora or YouTube Pro or whatever it's called. So there's a choice. It's not like Apple gives you the phone and says, hey, you're only allowed to use our apps, or else nobody would be interested.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think in terms of what you said before about the iOS being separate from the App Store,
Mm-hmm.
I think this is kind of an interesting kind of maybe case study or whatever you want to call it, because the way the revenue might be recognized might be separate, but if you look at it this way, I mean, the App Store is essentially confined to iOS. It doesn't exist outside of iOS. Yeah, Mac has its own app store, and Apple TV has its own app store, but they all have their
Yep.
own app stores, which all require different apps because, developing for one is, separate from developing for another. And so,
That's not true anymore.
no.
That's not true anymore.
But
As of
they still have separate offerings for apps. So maybe on the developer side, maybe it's not completely different, but they still have the separate apps.
they do, but nowadays you can build one app and run it on most of those. Mac OS is a little bit special because iOS apps will be able to directly run on Mac OS and will be distributed through the App Store once the Apple Silicon-based Macs start coming out for users. As of right now, there are ways to port your iOS apps to Mac OS and effectively offer the same app on both. Cross-platform, the same app, no code rewrite required. It's literally a checkbox that enables Mac OS support for the most part. And for smaller apps, you don't have to make very many changes. In fact, Impeached uses that technology for its Mac OS version, except it was rejected by the App Store for arbitrary reasons.
So kind of on that thought, I know you've had a lot of concerns about the review process and the guidelines. I don't think we touched on that too much, so maybe if you want to talk about that a little bit more.
Sure. So I think that Apple wants to do what's right as far as the guidelines. They want to create a positive environment for all of their users, and there's rules such as no explicit sexual content, for example, which they say is to protect the kids and from seeing inappropriate content, and I think that's fair. However, the guidelines are not evenly applied to all developers. Let's take Spotify, for example, okay? So Spotify and Apple had a big beef a few years ago for actually the same reason as Epic, because Apple was taking a 30% cut. And long story short, Spotify ended up changing their app so that you could subscribe to Spotify only from their website, not through the app, and then you would simply log in through the app. A few years later, there's an app called Hey that came out. And they, if I remember correctly, did the same thing as Spotify did, where they offer their subscription through their website, and then you could log into the app and use it as usual, right? But guess what? They got rejected from the App Store, despite doing the exact same thing as Spotify and Netflix. Eventually, Apple, after much backlash from the developer community and probably many users of that app, they ended up changing it and allowing them to go through using the Spotify loophole. But then fast forward a few months, and Microsoft wanted to release their gaming service, which I believe is called xCloud. Don't quote me on that. I don't play games on my phone, or console games on my phone. But
cloud gaming is not where it needs to be. But that's a separate issue.
I will not be playing Forza on my phone. Anyway. No, but I can understand why people would want to use it. And Apple rejected Microsoft's cloud gaming platform because they said they couldn't review all of the games independently, and those should all be distributed separately through the App Store. Then how on earth is Netflix allowed? Apple doesn't review all of their shows separately. They don't have to distribute those all separately through the iTunes store. It's extremely inconsistent. For my app in particular, I got kicked out because of a fictional pandemic that had been in the app for 2 years. And they kicked me out at the time when Plague Inc. was #1 on the App Store. Do you see where I'm going with this? Like, how does that make any sense? The #1 app on the App Store is violating a guideline that I don't believe exists to a point that I couldn't even dream to violate it. And yet I'm the one getting in trouble? Why is that? Well, maybe it's because Plague Inc. makes millions of dollars and I don't. I think that's a reasonable conclusion. I don't think I'm jumping to conclusions there, because it is truly and obviously the case, because Plague Inc. is a game that specifically deals with pandemics and wiping out the human race. Yet my app got in trouble for being inappropriate information about when I never mentioned it. It didn't even exist when that part of the app was built and released. So, and feel free to censor that use of the term. I don't want you to get demonetized. But
I'm gonna have to go scrub through now and find that you specifically mentioned.
I'm sorry, I forgot. I'm not a YouTuber. I'm not a YouTuber. I forgot. I'm sorry. No, but I think that the discrepancies between between developers, the way that Apple applies these guidelines to developers, I think that's unfair. And I mean, look, like, they're shutting down apps for doing things that really aren't wrong, while allowing larger apps to survive doing the exact same thing. And I think that would be that issue might be helped a lot by having the option to have third-party app stores, because a lot of apps that would be rejected from the App Store would choose a third-party store to distribute through, or perhaps distribute through their own website or some other alternative download method. And I think that, Apple would lose a little bit of the control that they have over exactly what gets done how on iOS, and users would be able to pick what they want to see rather than simply being able to access what Apple wants them to see.
Mm-hmm. All right, so you made a lot of points there.
I'm sorry, I can go off. What time is it? Oh, it's 2. Could we pause for 1 second? I just have to message somebody.
Oh, yeah. All right, so we're back from the little pause there, but you talked a little bit about how the Xbox game streaming service kind of had to go through that hoop, but I think it's also, maybe it's in the nature of the content, because you mentioned Netflix, but I think this can also kind of be applied to other services like Spotify.
Sure.
Because they do music, and maybe it's in the nature of the content itself, because a game is more like, a game would essentially be an app itself as compared to something that is a TV show / movie or music in the case of Spotify. So
I think that a game would be more comparable to a movie than a song, because at the end of the day, I mean, many games are comparable to an interactive movie where, there's a storyline, there's a plot. It's just that you get to make some of the decisions, you get to, participate in the action, if you will, as opposed to a song where it's an audio track for a few minutes. And I really think that games would be more comparable to something like Netflix. But I mean, at the end of the day, I think that's just a little bit weird, because normally, those games would be distributed separately, but this isn't normally. This is a service that allows you to play games that otherwise would not be playable on your phone, because they need to run on, console hardware, or maybe in the future PC hardware or something else. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So why would Microsoft get in trouble for that, but not Netflix? Because I mean, you can have movies with some quite objectionable content. You can have games with objectionable content. Why would they be different? I don't think that there's a valid reason for them to be treated differently in that way.
Well, I think in this case, on iOS, if you want to play a game, you have to download an app. That's how games are distributed on iOS devices, whereas with a movie, that's not the case, and with music as well.
Well, I mean, if you look at any other platform, right? Like, take PC, for example. For normal PC games, games are downloaded from a browser or from Steam or, Microsoft Store or whatever. That's the normal way of downloading things. But if a streaming service comes along, well, that's a completely different way of accessing that content. And I don't think it's fair to say that since this is the status quo on how games are played on iOS, that's how it should be forever. And personally, I'm not a fan of game streaming services. That's not the way that I like to play my games. I would prefer to, purchase them outright and have them forever. But I can understand why other people might want to stream their games. And I think that Apple is being greedy and unfair in not allowing Microsoft's game streaming service to exist. Because, okay, let's look at it this way. If it was some rando that wanted to put in stuff, unmoderated through the App Store, I think a lot of people would agree that, okay, maybe that's not the greatest idea. But this is Microsoft. If you trust Netflix, I think we can trust Microsoft to put out good games. They've had a great track record over the last 20 so years in releasing good games that, probably wouldn't violate any content guidelines anyway. And I mean, these are existing games that already have fans on other platforms. Why would you not want that on your platform as well? It's just bizarre. I don't see what Apple's trying to do here, other than collect their 30% tax, which they can't do if the game is streamed.
Well, I think an interesting, I don't know if I'd call it a solution, but maybe a workaround was the potential to download kind of shell apps, essentially.
But that's so dirty.
Yeah, I know. To be honest, in this case, I do think it's a bit ridiculous to have to download the apps separately or whatever the case may be.
I agree.
Instead of actually being able to stream, especially considering in this case it is from a reputable source like Microsoft.
It is Microsoft. It's they're a big company. They're well known for making games and for having games made. They own Xbox, which is a reputable system. The only reasonable reason why Apple would reject them from the App Store, because this app would be beneficial to them and to their users, is because they can't collect the 30% tax. There's no other reason that makes sense. The shell app thing, that's just silly if you ask me. Like, what purpose would a shell app serve exactly?
Oh, the specific purpose, there is no real specific purpose. I was just mentioning that was a potential solution to Apple's rules.
I've read about this online, but my question is, why would they do that? Why are they doing so much to avoid having to open up the App Store, iOS just a little bit more? They're actively harming developers, users, and themselves just so they can collect that 30% tax. And then on top of that, they also go out and upset developers and users by rejecting apps for arbitrary reasons. I can't see how this benefits them. It doesn't make sense.
Well, I do think
everyone loses.
And from knowing you and knowing a few other developers and hearing how you guys feel about especially the review process, it does definitely give off the impression of being highly arbitrary.
It is.
So obviously I don't have exact control over the Apple review process or really anything Apple necessarily does, but I think it would be best for them to exactly hammer down specific guidelines and kind of not leave room for interpretation for the App Store review process, because then you don't want to have a system where it kind of depends on which reviewer you get.
Exactly. And even then, so I built an app and I spent my time, working on this app, and it was a game, and it wasn't a particularly complex game. It was, more of a casual game that it's fun because you're just going really fast. Right. It was a clicking game. So
yeah, kind of the type of games put out by like Ketchup and Voodoo.
Sure, yeah, actually, like similar to that. It's just a little fun game that you play when you're bored on the bus or something. And I submitted it to the App Store, and it was a legitimate game. It had 2 different modes that you could play. It was like a nicely built app. It was fairly well done, if I do say so myself, and I submitted it to Apple. And it got rejected for a variety of reasons, many of which were completely untrue and verifiably untrue. And I ended up appealing this decision, and the appeal got rejected. I ended up speaking on the phone to Bianca from Apple. Please mute or censor that. But anyways, but I spoke to her, and she gave me no useful information. I wasted all of that time, developing that app, submitting it to the App Store, fighting app review, talking to them on the phone, doing the most to get this app out, and at the end of the day, nope. And all of that for arbitrary reasons. And it's like I tried to resubmit it, and I did my best to change the app so that it would fit the guidelines. One of the reasons that they rejected my app was, it had XYZ bugs. So I went in, and they were very rare to begin with, but I went in and I fixed the ones that existed because one of them straight up didn't exist. But I went in and not even kidding, man. But I fixed the ones that did exist, and I resubmitted, and they came back with different, it's ridiculous. As a developer, this is not something that I want to deal with. And you know me very well. You know that for many reasons, I only publish for iOS, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because there's just no benefit to me to publish on Android. But this experience has been so frustrating for me that not only did I consider building for Android, I'm planning to build for Windows now. Instead, I'm looking into becoming a game developer for Windows, because at least on Windows, I don't have to deal with Apple and their ridiculous arbitrary rules.
Mm-hmm.
And they're driving away developers. They're driving away users that can't access the apps they want. I know people that bought Androids because at least you can run emulators on Android. You know what? The best emulator apps for mobile are actually iOS apps. But they're so cumbersome to install and keep installed because of Apple's nonsense that I have seen people switch to Android so that they can get those apps easily. Nobody wins because of Apple's decisions is causing everyone to lose. Everyone, including themselves. It doesn't make any sense.
I would definitely say from a business perspective, it is definitely in Apple's best interest to kind of get the variability of the review process as little as possible, because you don't want to have a high variability between the reviewers. And there's kind of two ways to go and kind of try and solve this problem. They're not mutually exclusive, but you can kind of make the review process much more specific and much more hammered down, and leave as a little room for interpretation as you can. And then second of all, just do better training and just try to hammer down that, okay, this is how you should view this thing, this is how you should view that thing.
And I think opening themselves up to a little bit of competition would drive them to fix those issues, because right now the App Store has been out for 12 years, right? It came out in 2008. And for the last 12 years, we have had the same review process. And sure, it's a little bit faster now, but it's always been locked into Apple only. Developers have never had a choice. Users have never had a choice without jailbreaking the devices. And it's been this way for so long, and people are getting fed up with it. This isn't a good system. This isn't something that is fun to deal with. And I appreciate Epic for stepping in and suing Apple, because Apple has been stepping all over smaller developers for the last 12 years, and none of us could do anything about it because we're too small. You can try to fight app review all you want to get your app in, but even if your app gets in, what about the other thousands of developers that didn't get their apps in? None of us are large enough to step in and potentially have something done about this issue until Epic got there. And Epic finally came in and said, hey, this is enough. Apple has been abusing developers and users for too long. Let's fight them. And sure, you could argue that maybe some of Epic's methods or maybe some of their arguments aren't the most sound. But at the end of the day, what Epic is doing even if it's just by, side effect of them trying to help themselves, if they were successful, they would help the developer and users, the developer community and all of the users just in general. And I think that would be beneficial for everyone.
I mentioned this a little bit before, but from a legal standpoint, the law doesn't really seem to be on Epic's side. But I think you do make a point that even if Epic loses the legal battle, if there is enough public pressure, it may be enough to influence Apple and change maybe not all of their policies, but at least some of their policies.
Right.
And just one little thing that I wanted to touch on, we did talk a little bit earlier about kind of how Apple recognizes their revenue and how they kind of separate their different business segments.
Yep.
And you mentioned that the App Store was under the services category and separate from the iPhone category. But I just wanted to read a line from Apple's annual report and their notes to how they recognize revenue. So I'll just read that right now. So revenue allocated to the product-related bundled services and unspecified software upgrade rights is deferred and recognized on a straight line basis over the estimated period they are expected to be provided. So that's a bit of accounting lingo, but to kind of translate that into English, it essentially means that the services that are bundled with the hardware products and also, although this is kind of separate, but the fact that they receive upgrades, it will be recognized as revenue over a set period of time over the estimated life of the device.
Sure. But I mean, look at other bundled services that might be included in that category. There's Apple Music and there's also iCloud. And I guess most of the subscriptions that would be under Apple One, right? Do you agree? But with iCloud, you have the option of using Dropbox or Google Drive as an alternative cloud storage service. With Apple Music, you have the opportunity to use Spotify or another subscription service for that. Apple Arcade is sort of an outlier because Apple rejected their competitors from the App Store, which is kind of ridiculous. But that's the thing. Like all of the other subscriptions have competition. What's so special about Apple Arcade or the App Store? It really does seem like Apple is trying to shut out their competition here, because that is definitely a large revenue stream for them, because if all of the software that is purchased on iOS is purchased through the App Store, and there's 2 billion devices in circulation, well, that's a lot of money. And I understand and respect that, but at the same time, it's a little bit ridiculous to sell a phone for $1,000 that you can't install apps on. It's a generic computing device that is comparable to a Mac. iOS apps will be running on macOS soon. Soon, iOS devices, macOS devices, and pretty much all Apple devices will be running on the same architecture. What makes them so different? You can install the same kinds of apps. You can do the same kinds of things. You can install Microsoft Word on your phone. You can install Microsoft Word on your Mac. Where is the difference? So why is there a difference in terms of how software can be distributed? The Mac has an app store, but it also has a browser you can download from. iOS has an app store, but you can't download independent apps.
I think the point that I was trying to make is that to kind of show that the way Apple views these services and these products is kind of as part in the App Store. They kind of view it as part of iOS specifically, sure. And so that's how they treat it. And so
what I'm saying is iCloud and Apple Music would also be part of iOS, and yet you can get competitors that tend to be better than Apple's offerings, by the way. And despite them being bundled with iOS and included, they tried to stop Spotify as competition, but they ended up not doing that. So why are all competitors to the App Store shut out?
Oh, well, I think in this case, the legal basis is the fact that if it's part of iOS, you can't like you can't say that it has a monopoly over iOS apps because it is part of iOS and it's an integral part of iOS itself, and that's how Apple treats it.
Sure, but that's the thing. Being an integral part of iOS is not mutually exclusive with having third-party stores on iOS.
Mm.
If the App Store is a permanent part of iOS, it can't be removed, or that's all fine and good. That's fair. However, that shouldn't exclude other distribution platforms. In the same way
I
that
think
you can't delete iCloud from your iOS device, but you still can download Dropbox, Google Drive, Mega, or any of the other services.
but I think it's also a case of those other services are not legally entitled to be able to do that.
I think Spotify might disagree with you because if if I remember correctly, I think Spotify was ready to bring in legal action back in 2014 when Apple had this entire nonsense with them and their payment system.
Well, I don't have that on hand, and I don't really recall that. But
Hang on.
just having a lawsuit ready does not necessarily mean
You're
that they
right,
would
but
have won.
this isn't the first time that this concern has been brought up.
I think it also is a case that this is maybe untreaded ground in terms of antitrust because these whole ecosystems are relatively new and this is really a testing ground for them. So we'll see where it goes. And I mean, who knows? Maybe this Apple v. Epic case might go all the way to the Supreme Court. I mean, it's hard to tell at the moment, but you never know.
Turns out Apple is currently being sued by Spotify for antitrust for the same reasons. Like this, I think this is a fairly common sentiment that Apple is being anti-competitive and that they are shutting out anything that, you know, might threaten their domination in the profits of iOS apps. And it's just, I don't know, it's kind of silly.
Well, in any case, I think we've talked about everything that
I think so.
there is to talk about. I don't know if, like, obviously, there was no convincing to be done. It was just kind of a discussion.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. I change their mind. But I think we can both agree that hopefully, eventually, something will be done to improve the system, whether it goes all the way through court or not. I'm not here to, you know, see Apple lose a court case or anything like that. All I care about is that developers and users are treated fairly and that users have access to the apps that we developers spend so much of our time on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I said it a couple times before, but I do think that Apple will probably win this case, at least as it stands right now.
Well,
but I also think that they definitely need to work on their developer relations and how the whole system works, because you really don't want to disgruntle such an important part of, or an important base to your business.
I agree. I wholeheartedly agree. Well, thank
Alrighty.
you for having me on your show. Appreciated this. This was a good discussion, I think.
Is there anything else you'd like to add? You want to promote anything?
I mean, yeah, I got to do our obligatory self-promotion.
For anybody who's still watching, I don't know, man. You got a lot of time on your hands, I guess.
Hey, I mean, look, I got some good content. Just follow me on Twitter at JustinAlexP. You can find my apps on the App Store under my name, Justin Proulx. Or just search for Impeached, Be the President on the App Store. Should be the first one. And thank you so much.
Alrighty, thank you. And for you guys now, if you like this video, don't forget to absolutely destroy that like button.
Obliterate the like button.
Yes, of course. Don't forget to just destroy. I don't know. What's another adjective?
Ring the bell so hard it cracks.
Yes, press that ruby beautiful cherry red subscribe button and crack the notification bell.
More amazing content like this.
Feel free to go check out my Twitter. I'll have the link down below, and I'll have Justin's links as well. And if you guys want to use my Wealthsimple referral link, where if you deposit a bit of money, you'll get some free money as well. I'll link that below as well. I'll also link a few articles talking about the Apple v. Epic lawsuit if you guys want to do a bit of reading on it. So anyways, I think that just about wraps it up. So I'll see you guys next time. Thanks for watching.
We didn't tell them to comment. You said to like, subscribe, and ring the bell, but not to comment.
Oh, comment too, please. Alrighty, goodbye.